Welcome to episode 118 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue our review of Epicurus' letter to Herodotus, and we move further into the topic of images and the implications of those atoms flying through the air. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
Moreover, there are images like in shape to the solid bodies, far surpassing perceptible things in their subtlety of texture. For it is not impossible that such emanations should be formed in that which surrounds the object, nor that there should be opportunities for the formation of such hollow and thin frames, nor that there should be effluences which preserve the respective position and order which they had before in the solid bodies. These images we call idols. Next, nothing among perceptible things contradicts the belief that the images have unsurpassable fineness of texture, and for this reason they have also unsurpassable speed of motion, since the movement of all their atoms is uniform, and besides, nothing or very few things hinder their emission by collisions, whereas a body composed of many or infinite atoms is at once hindered by collisions. Besides this, nothing contradicts the belief that the creation of the idols takes place as quick as thought, for the flow of atoms from the surface of bodies is continuous, yet it cannot be detected by any lessening in the size of the object, because of the constant filling up of what is lost. The flow of images preserves for a long time the position and order of the atoms in the solid body, though it is occasionally confused. Moreover, compound idols are quickly formed in the air around, because it is not necessary for the substance to be filled in deep inside. And besides, there are certain other methods in which existences of this sort are produced, for not one of these beliefs is contradicted by our sensations. If one looks to see in what way sensation will bring us the clear visions from external objects, and in what way again the corresponding sequence of qualities and movements. Now, we must suppose, too, that it is when something enters us from external objects that we not only see, but think of their shapes. For external objects could not make on us an impression of the nature of their own color and shape by means of the air which lies between us and them, nor again by means of the rays or effluences of any sort which passes from us to them. Nearly so well as if models, similar in color and shape, leave the objects and enter according to their respective size, either into our sight or into our mind, moving along swiftly, and so, by this means, reproducing the image of a single continuous thing, and preserving the corresponding sequence of qualities and movements from the original object as the result of their uniform contact with us, kept up by the vibration of the atoms deep in the interior of the concrete body. And every image which we obtain by an act of apprehension on the part of the mind or of the sense organ, whether of shape or properties, this image is the shape or the properties of the concrete object, and is produced by the constant repetition of the image or the impression it has left. Now, falsehood and error always lie in the addition of opinion with regard to what is waiting to be confirmed or not contradicted, and then is not confirmed or is contradicted. For the similarity between the things which exist, which we call real, and the images received as a likeness of things and produced either in sleep or through some other acts of apprehension on the part of the mind or the other instruments of judgment, could never be unless there were some effluences of this nature actually brought into contact with our senses. And error would not exist unless another kind of movement too were produced inside ourselves, closely linked to the apprehension of images, but differing from it. And it is owing to this, supposing it is not confirmed or is contradicted, that falsehood arises. But if it is confirmed or not contradicted, it is true. Therefore, we must do our best to keep this doctrine in mind, in order that, on the one hand, the standards of judgment dependent on the clear visions may not be undermined, and on the other, error may not be as firmly established as truth, and so throw all into confusion.
Joshua, thank you for reading that for us this morning. As we get started today, I want to go on record as saying that this subject has always been one of the most complicated and mysterious to me of all of what I've read in Epicurus over the years, even to the point where I'm not comfortable myself saying whether I think he's right or wrong, because I don't know that I understand what he's even saying about a lot of this. And so as we go through today, I want to have that caveat in everything that I say, that I recognize that this is a subject that I am far from mastering or even beginning to master. And so hopefully, as we discuss it today, we can bring out some points that will be of interest and perhaps spur other people to make more progress in producing a better explanation of what he's talking about here than we currently have. Because I think this is a subject that people tend to skip over. I know when I read Lucretius, this is in book 4, and the whole subject of images ends up being dismissed or as laughable, perhaps even. But I think it deserves better than that. Unfortunately, the person who can talk about it better than that, I've not met that person yet or read his article. So I'm hopeful that we'll eventually find some good articles and some good explanations that would make some sense of all of this. As we talk about it today, I would suggest that we focus on how the first part from lines 46 through 48 sort of set the stage with the physics of what's going on here. And then 49 through the end, 49 through 52, it seems to me that the emphasis is sort of shifting from the physics of what's going on more to a discussion of how our minds are processing whatever it is we've identified in the first part here. Even to the point where I wonder sometimes if the main issue of images is not related to vision, but related to how the mind is processing things internally. 50 through 52 especially seem to be revolving around that. So maybe one of the first things I'd like us to talk about would be going back to line 46. There are pretty clear keys here, maybe even more clear than is in Lucretius, to the division between these images or idols which are visible versus those which are not visible. And I don't know whether he's using the same Greek word in every case or not, but even in the very first line, he says, "Moreover, there are images like in shape to the solid bodies, far surpassing perceptible things in their subtlety of texture." So I would read that as a key, that there are images which are visible, which are perceptible to us, but then he's also being very clear that he's about to discuss images or idols or whatever name you wish to give to them that are not perceptible to the eyes. And so let's talk about that point. Joshua and Martin, do you guys agree that he's talking about two separate things in the sense of visible images versus invisible images that are related but separate? What do you guys think about that?
In the way he writes it here, it's not really separate by production, but it's separate by perception.
Meaning, Martin, that the body that we're talking about that's under observation is generating both at the same time, but that our eyes are able to perceive some of what's generated, but not all of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it is not clear whether this is what we would call visible image, and then this what we, it is visible in the sense we see it with our eyes, and those what we perceive with the mind, from where it's written here, it looks like it's the same image. It just the way we perceive it is different.
Joshua.
Well, when I move down to the Hicks translation here, what it says is, again, there are outlines or films which are of the same shape as solid bodies, but of a thinness far exceeding that of any object that we see. And so on that point, it seems to me the distinction he might be drawing here is not necessarily between the visible and the invisible, but between the images and the bodies that they emanate from. But I agree with you. This is very difficult material to get a hold of. Already in the first sentence, we're having trouble.
And of course, Joshua, when you say it the way you just did, at least if this translation is correct, he's not focusing on whether we can see it or not, but he's focusing on whether we can perceive it or not. The word here in Bailey, at least, is perceptible. And perception covers more than just the eyes. It presumably covers hearing, smelling, touching, tasting as well. So probably it's not just limited to the eyes for that reason too. There's so much here that maybe we can piece together clues as we go through parts of it. Let me turn now. The next thing that's fascinating to me to observe is the way the next couple of assertions are structured. For it's not impossible. And then 47, next, nothing among perceptible things contradicts the belief. And then 48, besides this, nothing contradicts the belief that the creation of the idols takes place as quick as thought. Is it not a little bit unusual that he seems to be focusing his proof argument on the fact that it's not impossible and that perceptible things don't contradict it? Is it not normal that we would start with something that gives us evidence? What is the thing that gives us evidence of this subject before we make the observation that nothing contradicts it?
What we know is so that by combining our senses, everything seems normally to make sense. That means we receive actually, in some sense, images, or in some way we can perceive with our eyes an object which is not too far from us, if there's enough light that we can actually see it. And so in that sense, so perception is something, what at that time they considered them real, and what nowadays we in principle could also then consider as real. And based on that one, then that we have a base for something, so what we can sense, so that we can take this one then as real and think about how this perception happens. And then, of course, it becomes speculative, and that's why he then is here cautious and says just nothing contradicts that belief.
Joshua?
Right, because what you really need here is you already think that you've established atomism to a degree beyond a reasonable doubt. That seems to have been the starting position. And then you've also got this phenomenon in nature, which is the phenomenon of vision or sight, and how we see objects that are far away from us, that needs to be explained. You've got to come up with a way to explain how an object far away from us, how we can see that with our eyes when we're not touching it. Because most other of the senses, maybe apart from smell, we have to actually be touching it, right? It's got to be on your tongue before you can taste it. You know, it's got to touch the sensory organ. And with smell, he gets around that by saying that it smell particles, which is true, that travel, they even travel through walls because they're not actually solid. They travel through space or through the air. And when they sort of impinge or encroach on your olfactory sense, that's when the sense of smell comes into play. And then with hearing, it's the same way. So what the problem is, how do you explain vision? Because vision in many ways is, I think, probably of the five senses, it's the one that we most associate with ourselves. When people identify like which part of their body they are, they tend to point like behind the eyes, That's the idea, is that like behind the eyes is somewhere where I exist. more so than I exist in my ankle, for example. Nobody points to their ankle and says, like, this is where I am in this mass of bone and flesh. It's somewhere in the head, specifically behind the eyes, because this is sort of the constant thing that we're always using. It's one of the more important, I think, of the sensations, but it's just something that people have this real intimate connection with, their eyes and their sight. And so how you take this thing, which is in most people's mind maybe like where they center their sense of being in their own body, and then you have to try to find a way to explain that in a way that is in accord with everything else you've already tried to explain, which is this architecture of the theory of atomism. And if I can find the page here, I'll go into a little bit of what some of the alternative ideas. But for now, maybe press on.
Yeah. Joshua, as I listen to you talk, I bounce back and forth between the possibility that maybe all of this is directed at what we would call vision or sight. And maybe he's not suggesting something beyond the visible. But I think there's a pretty good bit of evidence that he is suggesting something beyond that which is visible. I agree with you that explanation of vision has got to have been extremely important for Epicurus or for anybody else. The whole issue of how you perceive something at a distance from you, whether something's traveling from you to it or from it to you, or whether there's some other explanation involved, has got to be a particularly important topic to think about and to explain, since you rely on it for so much in general. And just again, as we would see in Book 4 of Lucretius, I don't believe he goes into illusions and distortions here in the letter to Herodotus, but he very clearly spends significant time on how we can run into optical illusions in Book 4 of Lucretius. So if you're going to be relying on your vision so strongly as to how to live your life, you've logically, I would think, got to understand how it works and when it is subject to distortions and when it is going to be most clear and things like that, which I think is pretty clearly implied in 49 through 52 of what we're reading today. I have a feeling I'm going to be wanting to just jump around everywhere within this section. I'm not going to do as well in going forward with it in sequence because, like my eyes caught by 49, now we must suppose too that it is when something enters us from external objects that we not only see but think of their shapes. And it seems to me there's significant implication here that the mind is somehow receiving some form of images directly and not through the eyes. And in fact, one of the very interesting passages from Cicero's correspondence to Cassius Longinus is a reference to joking back and forth about the word specters is used in that, where Cicero is needling Cassius about the fact that Cicero has been thinking a lot about Cassius over the recent days and weeks. And Cicero is wondering whether he's thinking about Cassius because he's receiving images through the air of Cassius, or whether there's some other reason that he is thinking of him. And so there's that, which is a pretty clear reference. And I think there's a significant number of others that I'm not going to be able to pull together right this second that seem to imply that the thought processes can be affected directly by images other than through the eyes. And while I'm rambling right this second, I would refer to line 722 of Book 4. The beginning of Book 4 has talked a lot about the eyes and all the issues of illusions. But then he comes back in 722 and says, "Come now, let me tell you what things stir the mind, and learn in a few words whence come the things which come into the understanding." And then he says, "First of all, I say this, that many idols of things wander about in many ways, in all directions, on every side, fine idols which easily become linked with one another in the air when they come across one another's path, like spiders' webs and gold leaf. For indeed these idols are far finer in their texture than those which fill the eyes and arouse sight, since these pierce through the pores of the body and awake the fine nature of the mind within and arouse its sensation. That's, again, line 724 of Book 4 of Lucretius. It seems to me to be a very clear statement that some type of images is flowing into the body or the mind and perceived directly without going through the eyes. One other thing I want to throw in while I'm rambling would be that in preparation for today, I went back to the DeWitt book to see where DeWitt treats the issue of these images that we're talking about. And I think he does cover it in a number of different places, but he doesn't have a separate section on idols or images under physics or under atomism. He has it under his chapter 11, Soul, Sensation, and Mind, and the major discussion of images that DeWitt has seen fit to organize it as is under the title Mind as a Super Sense, which is on page 214 of his book. So I know I've been rambling here on this topic of whether we're talking about visible images or whether we're talking about something that is processed directly by the mind or the body without going through the eyes, without resolving anything in my mind, but at least making a couple of points about where it occurs in the text.
Yeah, so that means in Lucretius it's spelled out clearly that the particles which transmit the image which actually triggers perception through the eye, and those which trigger the direct perception in the mind are different particles. Whereas here in this letter to Herodotus, it is not clear that these are different. It's rather, I rather get the impression that we're the same particles.
And you know, Martin, you're saying that reminds me, we always like references to our friend Don, who's not here on the podcast right now, but I think Don made the point that one of the things that he's always found most difficult on this topic was the issue of whether these images can recombine and combine among themselves in the air. And line 732 of Lucretius, which is right after what I just quoted, explains that aspect by saying this. He says, "And so we see centaurs and the limbs of Scylus and the dog faces of Cerberus and the idols of those who have met death and whose bones are held in the embrace of earth, since idols of every kind are born everywhere, some of which are created of their own accord, even in the air, some of which depart in each case from diverse things, and those again which are made and put together from the shapes of these. For in truth, the image of the centaur comes not from a living thing, since there never was the nature of such a living creature. But when by chance the images of man and horse have met, they cling together readily at once, as we have said before now, because of their subtle nature and fine fabric. All other things of this kind are fashioned in the same way, and when they move nimbly with exceeding lightness, as I've shown before now, any one such subtle image stirs the mind, for the mind is fine and of itself wondrous nimble." And then one more line, "That these things come to pass, as I tell, you may easily learn from this, inasmuch as the one is like the other. What we see with the mind and what we see with the eyes, they must needs be created in like manner." So, at least from Epicurus' point of view, I'm gathering that he's thinking that every object is giving off atoms from its surface that keep the shape of the object, but that are constantly moving through the air, basically in all directions, some of which we're able to see, some of which apparently the mind is somehow able to perceive. Without commenting on whether I think that's right or wrong, I'm struggling even to define what he's saying, but that's the best I think I can come up with.
There's another quote which I can't find and I'm not going to look for anymore, but it says something to the effect of dreams are not, they don't really signify anything. They're just the result of images that impinge on the mind. So there's that aspect of as well as how do you see things in your mind when the eyes are closed? And there seems to be this issue of images from the outside impinging on the mind as part of that.
Joshua, if you gather your thoughts for just a second, I'll point out it's line 757 of Book 4 of Lucretius. "When sleep has relaxed the limbs, the understanding of the mind is for no other cause awake, but that these same idols stir our minds then, as when we are awake, insomuch as we surely seem to behold even one who has quitted life and is holden by death and the earth." So that's section 757 of Book 4.
Oh, did you just read that and I wasn't paying attention?
No, I did not just read it. I stopped right before I got to it because this is all in the
Gotcha.
700s of book 4.
Yeah, you could almost read the whole book, couldn't you?
Yeah, that's probably why book 4 is probably one of the least discussed books out there. It's got this very important section on illusions and how the senses have to be trusted. But other than that, the rest of the book is kind of given up to this images question that people just blow off. I'm sorry, Joshua, I interrupted you. Can you, if you can reconstruct what you were thinking?
One of the interesting things about Lucretius is that he has a particular affinity for animals. He really seems to like them. And in the opening hymn to Venus, there's this line that says, "Through you all things are made, and rising up, look upon the lights of the sun." So this is something that in his view, like the first interesting thing he wants to say about the newborn animal is opening their eyes on this wonderful new world they've been born into. So this issue of the visible, it does seem to be really important to him. The invisible, which is more difficult to get a hold of, certainly there is sufficient textual evidence, I think, although I can't really read the Greek, so that's a problem, but I think is sufficiently well established. And then it just becomes a question of how it happens. The other thing that we haven't gotten into, and I can't remember if this is in book 4 of Lucretius or not, but the important thing about vision or theory of vision within the construct of atomism is that, like everything else in atomism, it needs to be rigorously explainable, and it needs to preclude any need to call upon anything supernatural to explain it. It has to be explainable within the natural bounds of the system.
Well, I certainly think you're right that that's the subtext of almost everything that we're doing here is we're attempting to explain human life in the best way we can. I think Epicurus, if he were talking to us right now, he'd say that if there's evidence that, Joshua, your mind is being wired into the Bible and you're being programmed or directed by some supernatural force, and if there's evidence of that, then by all means, let's look at that evidence and embrace it and follow it wherever it leads. But he's saying in every case that there is no such evidence. And so in the absence of evidence of a supernatural direction and mechanism, what is the explanation that makes the most sense?
Right. Okay. I remember where I was going here. One of the other issues involved here is whether the senses are fundamentally reliable. And with vision, almost more than any other sense, there seems to be this issue of, as you said, of illusions, whether optical illusions or mental illusions or whatever else. I think the classic example from Epicureans in antiquity is this issue of the square tower that seems round when looked at from far away. And whether you accept Epicurus' response to this or not is up to you. But what he says in response to this problem is that the sense of sight, vision, is reliable. It's just that square towers do look round from far away. That's just how they look. And so your brain, or your sense of vision, is reporting accurately to your brain, which is hopefully interpreting things accurately, what's really going on. You're not going to see it as a square tower because they don't look square when you look at them from far away. As I say, whether that's a satisfactory answer or not will depend on the individual. Now, one thing I wanted to get into here a little bit is something we haven't talked about, which is that, of course, before Epicurus came up with his theory of vision in the ancient world, you had other theories to explain these things. You've got some people who think that the senses altogether are just completely unreliable. One of the more interesting theories of vision from the ancient world is the emission theory. And this was proposed, I think, first by Plato. And the emission theory proposes that visual perception is accomplished by rays of light emitted by the eyes. So this is kind of two almost opposite approaches here. Epicurus thought that solid objects constantly, all the time, were just emitting films of atoms from their surfaces that impinge on the eyes, and that's how we sense image, or that's how the sense of vision works. Plato thought, because of course he was an anatomist, so you can't have these atomic films emanating from the objects and impinging on the eyes. you've got to come up with something else. And what Plato came up with was the idea that the eyes themselves operate kind of like searchlights. And as you scan your eyes, you're actually sending out a beam of light that's illuminating the object that you're looking at. And that's why you can see it. So two completely different proposals for vision and for how it works. And I think, as in most things, Epicurus was less wrong about just the basic fundamental of how vision works. Because what really happens is you've got a third-party light source that illuminates the object, but doesn't simply illuminate the object. It strikes the photons of light strike the object, and then some of the color is absorbed, some of it is reflected, and that film of light that reflects off the object and hits the eye is how you see things. So it is a film in a sense that's coming from an object, but originally it's coming from a source of light separate from the object.
Yeah, except that it's not a film. And this is a thing which I also don't understand, that Epicurus didn't see it, that this doesn't make sense. Because in the way he explains atomism and how solids can stick together so that the atoms are confined in there, they confine each other. But there is nothing in one of these films which would keep these fine particles together. They should scatter around. There is no reason why they should not fall apart.
That's a good point, Martin. And there's another objection to be made, which is, I guess, not only does it have to be emitting an image from every direction, but it has to be emitting like multiple images. Like there have to be overlapping images, because if Cassius was standing 5 feet over from me and we were both looking at the same tree, there's going to be some overlap in the part of the tree that we both see. And so there have to be an almost infinite number of images being cast off by this tree in order for both of us to see what we see when we look at the tree.
Yeah, one of the problems is that the ancients apparently did not know how the eye actually works. If they had really known it, they would have invented the lens already, but they didn't. So, and that means they are grossly wrong in some ways on understanding vision.
It's interesting you say that. I read something recently, but I can't remember who wrote it. I'm going to have to find this. But he pulls a bunch of sources from different authors and just random quotes that they make. And his theory was that maybe the Greeks did come up with some sort of primitive microscope or telescope before, the Renaissance that's totally unknown to history.
Actually, I would expect that. That in ancient times that they made this discovery already. It's just puzzling to me that apparently not. But if there are sources now which point towards it, I mean, it would make sense.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look for that, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit some other day. But whether his argument was compelling or not, I don't know. But he certainly brought together a bunch of evidence from a whole bunch of different sources, things that are non-obvious to the eye that people are talking about that seem to suggest some additional aid to the eye in helping to see farther and or smaller. But Cassius, you had something to say.
Wasn't there a story about one of those scientists destroying some ships with mirrors? Who am I talking about there? That's not
Archimedes. That was Archimedes. So, yep. But that is a different thing. So that were mirrors and not lenses.
Yeah, I guess I've always kind of presumed that his mirrors might have been somehow, what would it be, convex versus concave, or somehow in order to get the heat high enough, I would presume you have to focus the light with the mirrors. Like maybe you can do that with these. There's a name for a type of oven that we use even today, where you unfold looks like an umbrella. Of mirrors. Oven. Yeah, solar oven. Yeah, I guess that's not, like you said, that's not the same as a lens though. But one of the lines that catches my eye based on what you're talking about there, Joshua, is in 48, for the flow of atoms from the surface of bodies is continuous, yet it cannot be detected by any lessening in the size of the object because of the constant filling up of what is lost. So not only is the object giving off atoms to constitute these idols, it's also receiving deposits, I guess, from idols that are striking it. I believe I've read different people talking about the idea that potentially this is related to how the Epicurean gods supposedly manage their own flow of atoms to their body. And maybe it even occurs in Lucretius about getting old, and that you're constantly either adding atoms to your body when you're younger and getting stronger, or shedding them faster than you're gaining them when you get older, something like that. Probably not directly related to this, but these atoms flowing through the air in all directions probably had all sorts of implications, because if you're not only giving them off but receiving them, I guess that could lead in all sorts of directions. Joshua, also along in the same area that we were talking about previously in book 4, we talked about the sleep issue, but there is, continuing on in that same section, he talks about, it's 779, when he talks about receiving the images. He says, first of all, it is asked why, whatever the whim may come to each of us to think of, straightway his mind thinks of that very thing. Do the idols keep watch on our will, and does the image rise up before us as soon as we desire, whether it pleases us to think of sea or land or sky either? Gatherings of men, a procession, banquets, battles, does nature create all things at a word and make them ready for us? And when in the same place and spot the mind of others is thinking of things all far different? I think that paragraph is intended to at least be raising the possibility that your mind is selectively tuning itself to the images that are passing through. And perhaps he's asking the question, I guess, whether your will of thinking about a particular thing tunes your mind to receive that particular image. And of course, this is, to even say it is to be basically ridiculous. But again, my first goal is always to understand what it is he's suggesting. So it's almost as if, and I believe I've read commentators talk about this, it's almost as if it is being suggested that the world around us is just constantly full of all of these images flowing at all times. And this gets back into the God issue, that perhaps what they're thinking and suggesting is that you can, through your willpower, I suppose, tune your mind to receive these images. I don't even know how to say it. To receive these images, to receive certain images at a particular time. That perhaps if you are thinking of, for example, divinity, gosh, I don't even want to state an example because it's all so speculative, but there just seems to be in this material the implication that you're surrounded by these images at all times. And so the question naturally arises, why is it that only certain images tend to occupy your mind at a particular moment? And again, maybe that's all just so far off from what we think is the case that it doesn't even make sense to entertain it. But whenever they say something, it's probably a good idea to at least make an effort to understand what they were thinking was even possible.
Is there not a passage in Lucretius? I think I know that this is in Chaucer and in Shakespeare, but I'm thinking that there was a passage in Lucretius about people who in the nighttime their minds are preoccupied by the things that they were doing during the day. So in other words, a soldier will think of battle, a lawyer.
Oh, that's it. That's in Lucretius. Absolutely. That a lawyer is going to dream of his cases and a politician is going to dream of. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know where that fits in, but it does seem to, because presumably it's not, the image of the lawyer's cases impinging on his mind during the night. It's the things that were observed and that occupied the mind during the day, which now at night the mind sort of continues to ruminate on. So to draw a distinction between those, I think would be rather difficult.
I do think that there's relevance here, though, and I keep thinking about these references to the gods, and I believe in book 5 in particular, it talks about how if you don't have holy views of the gods, you can be adversely impacted by their images. It's almost as if he's talking about that by your choices about what you think about, you are tuning your mind in a particular way so that it's going to behave or receive images of a particular type more so than others. which doesn't strike me as being a totally ridiculous idea. The images coming from the outside and so forth doesn't seem to comport with what we think is going on. But it certainly makes sense that if you're occupying your mind, training it in particular directions, it's going to think in those directions. Maybe you could say it in a better way, Joshua, but certainly if you have holy ideas about the gods, that they are imperturbable, that they're not going to bother you, that they're totally blissful, that they're deathless, that they're things to emulate, if those are your basic ideas that you think about when you think about divinity, then when you're on that mountaintop and you're looking at some awesome sight or something, probably it's more likely that that's going to spur something positive within you than if you spend all your day long thinking about God's roasting people in hell for eternity.
Right. So in Shakespeare, this idea or this passage, which I think is very similar to Lucretius, but it's not thought that there was any connection between the two, although it also shows up, I think, in Chaucer. Here's one passage from it. This comes from Romeo and Juliet, and it's Mercutio speaking, and he's talking about Queen Mab, if you remember the Queen Mab speech from though you know what I just thought of? The Queen Mab speech also is one of the only places in Shakespeare where he uses the word atoms. So isn't that remarkable?
Keep going, because I'm not familiar with the Queen Mab speech, but keep going. It sounds like it's as promising, though.
Let me find the whole thing. I got a small section here just on the soldiering bit, and we'll see if it's not too long. But it's a monologue by Mercutio, and he's trying to convince Romeo to forget about Rosaline and to go out and have some fun. So this is what he says, and maybe, God, it is rather long. I'll read the first part, and then maybe I'll skip down to what we're talking about here. He says, "Oh, then, I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomies, athwart men's noses as they lie asleep." So that's what she does. She her little tiny wagon that she's drawn by atoms is pulled over people's faces and then goes into their noses and starts to affect their dreams. And let me see if I can. Okay, here's where that part starts. She says, "Sometimes she gallops o'er a courtier's nose, and then he dreams of smelling out a suit." So this must be the lawyer part of it. "And sometimes comes she with tithe pig's tail, tickling a parson's nose as asleep he lies." That's quite difficult to read. "Then dreams he of another benefice." So this is a parson or a priest dreaming about the money coming into the church coffers. "Sometimes she driveth over a soldier's neck, and then dreams he of cutting foreign throats, of breaches, ambuscados, Spanish blades, of healths 5 fathom deep, and then anon drums in his ear, at which he starts and wakes, and being thus frighted swears a prayer or two, and sleeps again. This is that very Mab." So you might have, I don't know if you've got the Lucretius passage in front of you. I don't know how similar they are, but or what we should make of that exactly. I know I've heard or read that there's no good reason to suspect that Shakespeare will have read Lucretius, but
I don't know. I was about to answer your question as to the passage, but Joshua, how about Julius Caesar? Is there not a relatively extended discussion between Cassius and Brutus and Julius Caesar about the shade of Julius Caesar and seeing the ghost, Caesar's ghost, and Cassius explaining to Brutus that it's this very subject we're talking about? Is that not in Julius Caesar?
Yeah.
I have a feeling you're more familiar with Romeo and Juliet than you are with Julius Caesar, but and maybe that's a good thing, but I'm not so familiar.
Ironically, in high school, Julius Caesar was my favorite of the plays, but
Okay.
it's been a long time since I've read it.
Now I get confused because some of that material is in Plutarch under the life of Brutus of the life, I think. But I believe it's in Julius Caesar as well. And I think if we were writing an article comparing references in Shakespeare to images in Lucretius, we would want to cover both of those. Because when you say there's no reason to think that he read Lucretius, here it is in Book 4, line 962. And for the most part, to whatever pursuit each man clings and cleaves, or on whatever things we have before spent much time, so that the mind was more strained in the task than is wont, in our sleep we seem mostly to traffic in the same things. Lawyers think that they plead their cases and confront law with law. Generals that they fight and engage in battles. Sailors that they pass a life of conflict waged with the winds. And that we pursue our task and seek for the nature of things forever, and set it forth when it is found in writings in our country's tongues. Thus, for the most part, all other pursuits and arts seem to hold the minds of men in delusion during their sleep. Now, the last part, I lose the train of what he's trying to say there. But clearly in the first part, that's what you're saying, is that we dream about at night the things that we're engaged in during the day.
Right. Yeah. Edmund Spenser was writing right about the same time as Shakespeare, or maybe a little bit earlier. And the first sort of opening sequence of his great sort of book-length poem, The Faerie Queen, is a direct translation of Lucretius. So maybe there's more to this than I'm thinking. Maybe there's more Lucretius in Shakespeare than I've been led to believe.
If I can remember correctly, that's going to be the title that I assigned to this episode. There's more to this than meets the eye. There's more to Lucretian and Epicurean images discussions than meets the eye. There's a lot more here that we have not pulled out, that can be pulled out if we have the time and the inclination. And the Shakespeare material is probably a good clue for one way to interpret all of that. Let me mention this as well. It's almost like I'm just throwing random things up against the wall to see what sticks. But 858, that gets into the issue of food that I was mentioning earlier, about sort of an analogy that what food really is to us is another way of intaking atoms from the outside that add to our bodies. But here's in 877, we're still just bouncing around now in 49 through 52 of our passages for today. But 877. Next, how it comes to pass that we are able to plant our steps forward when we wish, how it is granted us to move our limbs in diverse ways, and what forces want to thrust forward this great bulk of our body, I will tell. Do hearken to my words. I say that first of all, idols of walking fall upon our mind and strike the mind as we have seen before. Then comes the will, for indeed no one begins to do anything ere the mind has seen beforehand what it will do. And inasmuch as it sees this beforehand, an image of the thing is formed. And so when the mind stirs itself so that it wishes to start and step forward, it straightway strikes the force of the soul, which is spread abroad in the whole body through limbs and frame. And that's easy to do since it's held in union with it. So he's equating the use and movement of idols within your mind and your body as the way in which you turn thought into action. That's why this is such a deep subject that we just should not skip over it like this. And of course, again, where would it be? Is that in 49 through 51? This would be something that would have to be included in a discussion of determinism and free will as well. Because if he's got a yes, if he's got a theory,
go ahead. You were willing to go on record as saying that every human action was premeditated.
I guess he could be saying, this seems to say clearly that some, and I think it's true, and that's what he said in the letter to Menicius, that some things are determined and some things are not. Some things are in our control and some things are not. Certain parts of the actions that we follow in life are set in motion because we see something and we're reacting to what we're seeing or feeling around us. I don't think anybody could object to that. Some part of that is stimulated from the outside, but I certainly wouldn't say that he says that everything is stimulated from the outside like that.
Now,
But
the other thing that's involved here is this issue of the prolepsis, and it has many different meanings in ancient Greek and a particular meaning in Epicurean philosophy, and it's another thing that I don't fully grasp very well. One of the meanings that this word seems to have had in antiquity is the idea that as things sort of impinge on your mind or affect your mind in some way, they begin to leave impressions. And so if you see a horse for the first time, it may not be naturally obvious where to categorize that in your mind. But as you continue to see horses doing different things, and, horses in stables and horses out on grassy meadows and horses drinking from the stream, you begin to get this idea of what horses are in your mind that didn't exist there before necessarily, but it's a series of impressions that just grow deeper and deeper that are left by your experience. Am I right on that?
I believe I've read that kind of commentary before, and it makes sense to me, yes.
Right. Okay. Well, now I've interrupted you. I don't know what you were.
No, I think we're in the middle of a wash cycle of our washing machine, because I'm just throwing things out there and jumbling them together and hoping something good's going to come out of the mix. But I think that there is, if our goal is to understand what Epicurus was teaching, I think this stuff has to be given more attention than we tend to give it. It could be that there's nothing more. I mean, there may not be anything here that contradicts free will. It could be that this is just part of his explanation of how the mind communicates with the rest of the body, and, for example, tells you to lift your hand or move it to the left or right. It could be that he's trying to come up with a comprehensive theory of the way your body and your mind are working that incorporates your sensations, your perceptions, and develops a theory as to how those perceptions are then turned into reactions within your body and the things that you do. I mean, the mind is, when we talk about free will, we don't mean that the mind is divinely supernatural. The mind has methods by which it would act just like any other organ would. So it would not be unexpected that he would attempt to come up with a comprehensive theory of thought processes and how our thought processes interact with our perceptions. Because, okay, maybe we should go ahead and focus on 49. Now, we must suppose, too, that when something enters us from external objects, that we not only see but think of their shapes. And so then he's talking about the issue of whether there's something between us and it or not, which I think we've already covered. But then 50, every image we obtain by an act of apprehension on the part of the mind or of the sense organs. So is there apprehension of the mind versus apprehension of the sense organs? The image is produced by the constant repetition of the image or the impression it has left. Now, falsehood and error always lie in the addition of opinion when our opinion is not confirmed or contradicted by the evidence. And then he talks about, in 51, the things we call real versus the images we receive as the likeness of things in sleep could never even exist unless there were some kind of, films actually brought into contact with our senses. And then error would not exist unless another kind of movement too were produced inside ourselves, closely linked to the apprehension of images, but differing from it. And then he talks about what's true and not true there. And then he says we must do our best to keep this doctrine in mind, which is pretty hard to do when you don't have a clue as to what he's saying, in order that on the one hand, the standards of judgment dependent on the clear visions may not be undermined, and that error may not be as firmly established as truth, so that everything is thrown into confusion. So I have a tendency to think that all of this discussion is not really just a primitive optics. It's more psychology almost of what's going on in your mind. Are your thoughts in some way actually pictures or images or specters within your mind that your mind is processing these images as, and is that the way he is attempting to construct a theory of the operation of your mind? Somebody say something more intelligent than what I just said.
Oh, you've just said a lot, so it would be, I think, very difficult to follow that. One thing I do want to say, and this is just to reinforce something that you've been saying, or that you said a number of times during this episode, which is that I do think you're absolutely right. We have something like an obligation to at least try to understand this stuff. it's no good to just glaze over it. And that's basically why we're doing this, right? And not just the letter to Herodotus, but going through Lucretius and Cicero. And the idea is we really want to engage on some kind of more than superficial level with the substance of the text and what we're dealing with and what was actually taught and thought in the ancient world, because that is another way to avoid an error of a different kind, which is the error of attributing to Epicurus or Lucretius or these other thinkers from classical antiquity things that they didn't actually say or believe, which is quite prevalent and a very easy thing to do. So whether or not this is easy to get a hold of, and I don't think it is nevertheless a very worthwhile thing to do, to really try and dig in here and get a grasp on what he's saying. And one more thing to say to that is, as usual, if we've left you more confused at the end of the episode than you were at the beginning of the episode, the discussion is always ongoing at the EpicureanFriends.com forum, where we have people who do seem to have a better grasp of this stuff maybe than you and I and maybe Martin, who are able, I think, to speak somewhat more intelligently on it. And that conversation, as I said, is always ongoing, and you can join us there. But if you're asking me to synthesize or make sense of everything you've just said, Cassius, I think there's a lot going on here, and it's very difficult to not only separate the claims that he's making and sort of dissect what is the actual claim that he's making. That's kind of hard to do. And then to really understand the claims that he's making within the context of, the 3rd or 4th century BC in Athens, when he's writing this stuff down, and what this meant to him and what this meant to his readers and how we should interpret it today. And it's all very difficult.
Yes. Looking at the clock, trying to begin to decide when we're going to start to wrap things up for today. I would like to do at least one more thing, though, before we wrap up. I've glanced already to see where Lucretius took this discussion, and it's very interesting to me where he takes it. But I have not looked to see what follows next here in the letter to Herodotus. We're going to go next, it looks like, to next week is going to be more discussion of the atoms moving in different ways, like hearing and even tasting, I think, and smelling. And so we're just going to stay with the issue of how atoms are the building blocks of our understanding of perception and human knowledge and therefore everything else. It's interesting to me that when I compare, though, where Lucretius goes next, which I guess could be an indication of where Epicurus goes in his larger books, he goes into the issue of sex. Guess what? Part of the connection must be he's still spending a significant amount of time on dreams and what's entering our mind and through whims and potentially these images, whether we're either awake or asleep. And somehow he connects dreaming to the issues of sex, which is where he closes book 4. Actually, I was talking about how book 4 is not really read very often. I should have been more precise and said the ending of book 4 is frequently discussed, because that's the whole issue of sex and romantic love and so forth that goes in there.
But not for you, dear listener, because we're talking about smell.
Right. We're talking about Herodotus, and he keeps going on the basic physics and doesn't go off on this tangent of romantic love or sex or the rest of things like that.
David Sedley makes the argument in his book, Lucretius and the Transformation of Greek Wisdom, that Lucretius was working with the 37 or 38 or whatever it is books on nature written by Epicurus, and that in his sort of first draft of the poem, he was going through just topic by topic by topic, just in the same order that Epicurus did. But it's thought maybe that in a later revision, he shuffled things around to an order that seemed more suitable to what he was trying to do with his epic didactic poem. So whether Epicurus went from images to well, of course we know we're reading his thing, don't we? But in the books on nature, it's not necessarily clear from either from this letter or from Lucretius where he might have gone next.
I guess I'm going to start to navigate us towards the ending for today. As long as you look at this from a very high level viewpoint, I don't have any problem at all thinking that it is very interesting to discuss the impact of the things that you see throughout your life on the things that you think and do. Even for somebody who's committed to a free will analysis, that we're not just automatons and billiard balls, we certainly are affected by the things that are around us. And maybe this is nothing more than suggesting that if you live in the Louvre and you're surrounded by the great works of Western civilization and art, might it be that your thought processes and even the things you choose to do with your life are at a little higher level than if you spent your time in maybe some modern art museum filled with representational weirdness? Maybe there's something profitable to think about in terms of that. I was looking before we started the episode today to see if I could come up with any analogies at all to other theories out there in the world that are non-supernatural and yet imply that you may be affected by your surroundings in some way other than just looking at them. And I came up, I suspect it's just nonsense. The only thing I could come up to even begin a list of comparable ideas with was, Martin, you probably know this better than I do. Is it feng shui?
Feng shui.
Feng shui. Feng shui. What is feng shui? Is that in any way comparable to what we're talking about, Joshua? Since you can pronounce it.
You mean do you mean feng shui, or what do you refer to?
Yeah, I'm asking, is feng shui in any sense a theory that you are affected by emanations from your surroundings in a non-supernatural way? Anything that's going to be supernatural, that's just going to be something was probably not even worth talking about. But is feng shui a theory that you are affected by your surroundings in some way?
Definitely. The important thing is where you arrange things in the house, rooms, how you orient the rooms in the house. So that's what that talks about. But I don't know more than that. So I myself never looked into it. It's just that I heard people talking about it here.
Okay, Joshua, your turn. You can pronounce it. So what is it?
My understanding of what feng shui involves, I think it sort of evolved out of this sort of sense in Chinese culture of geomancy, which is that the orientation of things on the landscape kind of affects, particularly what's being affected here by feng shui, or so the claim is made, is that you have this natural flow of qi, which is a kind of power. It's sort of indistinct, and that things that you do in the house can affect the flow. You can affect the flow negatively, you can affect the flow positively. If the flow is bad, you'll have poor effects in your life. If the flow is good, your life will be better. So, for example, if you imagine a T intersection, the road that runs into the T intersection, if there's a house at the top of the T, as it were, facing the road that runs into the T intersection, there's a sense in which all of the energy from the traffic and the lines and the geometry of it run into that house, that you're never going to have your feng shui in order if you buy that house. So whether there's a good connection there, I don't know, because to me, it's feng shui is so much centered around ideas like luck. I'm not sure luck has a huge impact in Epicurean philosophy. I can't really think of how it does. Epicurus seemed to think that,
well, if you decide to put your house at the very end of a T intersection, then you might end up with, whether it's luck or not, you might end up with a lot of vehicles in your front door, I guess.
Maybe. But,
I'm sorry, I cut you off in the middle, Joshua.
No.
Is it a supernatural force, or is it supposed to be some kind of an energy force that arguably is something that if somebody wanted to just not totally waste their time? I mean, is there some flow of energy involved that's natural, supposedly?
I don't know if it's See, I'm not sure it's necessarily the case in some of these non-Abrahamic religions that this idea of the difference between the supernatural and the natural is as strong as it is, right?
Okay.
This is very important in Abrahamic religions, that you understand the difference between the supernatural and the natural. But in something like Confucianism or Taoism or some of these Eastern religions or ways of life, I don't think it's necessarily the case that it's as important. And so they probably would have thought that they were understanding this in terms that made sense just on the basis of nature. But of
Okay.
course, a lot of these Eastern religions are also, what's the word, animistic, and so they have this idea that nature is more alive in a sense than we tend to think. What's the Japanese word, kame or something? I can't remember. The idea that like spirits, like even a rock has a spirit living in it, or that kind of thing.
Well, one of the ways that I've always tended to sort of test what I was reading in Lucretius or Epicurus would be that I would never expect Epicurus to come up with something that seems totally fantastic, totally without evidence, totally incredible, totally crazy. And so I'm not suggesting that his images theory gets close to that, but I would think that we would find, if he's onto something at all, we would find other examples of other people or other theories throughout the ages who had something similar. In fact, I think, Joshua, you've made the comment before that a lot of Epicurus's work seems to be he was almost wanting to compile or learn about all these other theories and sort of develop a theory of everything. It would seem unlikely that he would come up with something that is so uniquely without precedent. And I'm not able to come up with a good suggestion that there are parallel viewpoints in any other philosophy or religion or science or anything like that. But that's the way I think I would approach it over time. If I had more time to put into the issue of studying it, I would look for analogous theories of influences on your mind and your actions through your surroundings. Whether it's, I guess I've already made some comments on the forum about whether it's cosmic rays or whether it's cell phone radiation or whether it's sunspots or the influence of the moon or anything like that. And of course, that was one of the comments made on the forum too, the issue of migratory birds using magnetism somehow to orient their migrations. Whether there are examples of maybe in general, you might call it action at a distance of being influenced by other things that you're not in direct touch with through nature. My list is very short right now of parallel observations, and I probably ought to strike Feng Shui off of the number one position, the number one and only position that I had for this list this morning.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe you could put the Force on there from Star Wars or something. The living force, the midichlorians. That's it. The issue, I think, really, there's two questions here. One of them is your psychology affected by things outside of yourself? And in the discipline of psychology, that would just be the nature versus nurture debate. And I think that most people come down on some combination of the two, that nurture, in other words, outside influence, is hugely important in a person's life. And all of the evidence seems to suggest that. I think one of the examples of that I rather enjoy is the example of Montaigne, the French writer, who was raised by a rather unusual father. His father thought it was very important that he learn to speak Latin. And so Latin was actually Montaigne's first language. His father only hired servants and staff and tutors and that who were fluent in Latin.
Wow.
And so he grew up not speaking French as a first language, but speaking Latin as a first language. And his edition of Lucretius survives. It was found having been written over, but they found his name in the margin or something like that. And he had quite a lot of interest in the text and quoted it many times. So that's not really quite what you're asking, though. You seem to be asking for more of films or images, just flying about and impinging on the brain.
I'd be interested basically almost in anybody's commentary on this book 4 and of Lucretius. I think that's where we're going to find it developed most specifically. And I'm sure there are good academic articles out there about this aspect of book 4, but I know we just don't talk about them very much. And I think there's a lot that could be gained if we spend more time with it. Now, that's a good beginning of the end of the episode. Martin, comments that you'd like to throw in now, or just concluding thoughts?
Oh, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Joshua?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add either. No, I can't really think of anything.
Okay. Well, we've rambled all over the board today in an effort to at least pique the curiosity of readers in this section of Book 4. Hopefully we've done that, and we do invite anybody who would like to discuss any aspect of this to come by the forum, where there will be plenty of opportunities to follow up on this for years to come. So with that, let's close for the day, and we'll be back in a week. So thank you for your time today.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.